Jim Ceaser, welcome to the American Mind. Thank you for being here. Every 4 years I think to myself, is this any way to elect a president of the United States? And particularly I think that the process of running for president now has become crazy. I mean, the poignant tale of Mitt Romney, who has spent really the last 6 or maybe 7 years of his life running for president, first in 2008, then in the 2012 campaign, strikes me as a kind of miniature tragedy. I mean, the amount of time and the amount of energy and money it takes seems to me increasingly hard to justify, increasingly irrational in a way. Your first book was on the presidential selection system. And you showed in it that the founders had given a lot of thought to the qualities that we want in a president and the system by which we would select the president. So what do you think the founders would think of our present presidential selection process?
Well, they'd probably be more surprised at the presidential selection process than any of the other institutions which they created. And remember, when you look at the Constitution, our national institutions are not just President, Congress, and Court. They spent a lot of time fashioning a fourth institution, which is the presidential selection process. When you just look at the words of the Constitution, you see there were 4 national institutions. And the reason they spent so much time on it, they realized that the selection of the president would draw the most important persons in the country, and that if you didn't control this and take care of this in a healthy way, the whole system could crumble.
What do you mean by the fourth institution? You mean the Electoral College?
I mean, the entire system. It was essentially the Electoral College was their system, which was meant to include, as we would say today, nomination and election. Mm-hmm. So the selection process is one of the 4 national institutions just by a reading of the Constitution.
Now, one of the early changes to our political landscape was the introduction of political parties, which changed the presidential selection process from the sort of nonpartisan one, or at least non-party one, that the framers had devised. Explain that. What was the significance of that change?
Well, I think it is fair to say, though, it's one of the 4. It's the one that hasn't succeeded. It's, the current character of the system is very different, even though some of the institutions remain like the Electoral College. It's very different than the original design. And one thing that they had in mind for the selection of the president was, first, no campaign in the sense we have it today, and second, no political parties. So the development of political parties radically transformed the entire process in 2 ways. First, it meant that there was a process that escaped the Electoral College altogether, which was nomination, which had never been contemplated. And therefore, the privatization of that first stage, or the moving of it from an institution into an organization of the parties. And then the second thing, of course, was that the Electoral College changed. The electors were no longer discretionary agents. They became bound by the political parties, and therefore the character of the process changed.
Well, it would strike a contemporary American as so odd and even bizarre that you could have a presidential selection process without campaigns, much less without parties. I mean, anyone who's read the farewell address sort of, I guess, understands that George Washington and many in the founding generation looked askance at the institution of political parties. Now, why did party become respectable in American politics? Because that happened first, and then campaigns and campaigning came, as it were, in the wake of that initial change.
Well, parties formed in 2 moments. First, in a period in the 1790s when they were used and hadn't really become respectable. And then later in the 1820s and 30s when they actually attained, you could say, constitutional status with a small c. That is, they became acceptable, open, such that by the time you get to the 1840s, if you would have asked someone to explain the American political system, almost any observer would have mentioned the political parties, and that wouldn't have been the case before. And I think that the process of the legitimation of parties was due not only to the fact that there were differences of opinion, but to someone who thought, once again, about the presidential selection process, namely Martin Van Buren and some of the others, and who saw that in order to improve the process of presidential selection, you needed parties. So that Van Buren, in some ways, was took the same perspective of the founders. That is, he wasn't thinking only of who wins the presidency. He was thinking of how to structure the process. And I'd like to mention what he had in mind, which was in common with the founders. The founders were worried in the selection process about ambition gone astray, leading the candidates to demagogic politics to get into office. Mm-hmm. Van Buren was worried about the same thing, but under new circumstances where there already were popular candidates, there was already forms of campaigning on behalf of them. He thought parties, strangely, were the best mechanisms to restrain the ambition of candidates. Instead of having 5 or 6 candidates run as you had in 1824, each devising his own platform on the fly, each appealing in that sort of race to a different section of the country and dividing it, that political parties could step in, bring politicians back in, and moderate the process at the nominating stage.
So Martin Van Buren, who is the unlikely hero of your book, in a way, this first book of yours, reforms the system by turning it into a two-party system, or trying to turn it into a two-party system. But it's a new device to serve old ends. That's your argument, that it actually served both of the negative and the positive functions of a presidential selection system, to screen out demagogues, but to screen in, so to speak, qualified candidates.
And to offer something of a choice, and to provide what's important, the semblance of support or majority for a candidate. Because after all, if you have 5 candidates and they split the vote, you don't have the feeling that there's anyone who has generated a consensus. So parties don't merely reflect, they can also generate a consensus.
Plus, if we have 5 candidates, it tends to go to the decision is in the House of Representatives
it will
rather
go to the
than
House,
in the Electoral College. Yeah.
This is really the only time that we had this decision made in the House other than 1800.
Right.
But, and that would have continued. That was the system that everyone expected would continue until parties were refounded. Because imagine this, you have 5 no parties, 4 or 5 candidates running, it would split. Even as in 2008, all the candidates in the Republican primaries, all the candidates in the Democratic primaries would all have been in the final process.
Right.
So it would have had a quite different system.
Now, what happened subsequently after Van Buren's innovations and after sort of the late 19th century pattern of American politics, because the system changed dramatically in the 20th century. We didn't have primary elections in the 19th century nearly as frequently as we do in the 20th century, and the system, in a way, opened up out of the smoke-filled room of party control, and that had, I would say, advantages and disadvantages.
Exactly. I mean, the parties that Van Buren fashioned, it's true that they were interrupted in the Civil War, and that showed another quality of parties, that they don't only produce candidates, they also offer choice, and that was something that perhaps Van Buren didn't have in mind. But the parties kind of came back to their old system after the Civil War. They screened candidates, and that, according to progressives and others, was the problem. Because instead of getting energetic, bold leaders, people with a vision, people who had a concern for the country as a whole, the progressives charged that the presidential candidates were lackluster, incompetent, people who merely dealt with bosses and exchanged favors. So they really wanted to eliminate the Van Buren-type party. In some cases, some progressives wanted to get rid of parties altogether, but in other cases, the one that dominated is to change the party into something that forms around the presidential candidate. And the presidential candidate now becomes the center. And the vehicle for the presidential candidate becoming the center is to eliminate the convention as the deciding factor and focus on the primaries, bring the candidates into active campaigning, and then I think you could call it, let the people see the quality of the candidates in a process where they're engaged in debate. It's the beginning of what you could call leader democracy, which was, I think, the key point of the progressives. Build up the individual leader, and the party is a kind of shell that forms around that leader.
And from the founders' point of view, how would they evaluate that?
Well, they would have seen the danger of opening this up to demagogic style of politics. Now it is true that in one way the progressives' concern had one element of the founders in mind. They claimed that the presidents and presidential candidates of the late 19th century weren't worthy of the office. And they spoke of statesmanship, but then they qualified it and spoke of popular statesmanship, and especially popular leaders, the word leader having a different connotation than statesman. So while in one sense they wanted to elevate the office, in another sense they wanted to change and democratize it, to get this quality, here maybe was their great hope, that they assumed that this popular process would produce at once good presidents and non-demagogic politics. That was quite a hope, and I think the founders would have had grave questions about the last element, the ability to accomplish this without demagogic-style politics. And, of course, as we now have unlimited campaigns.
Yes, and debates.
And debates. Well, there could be something said in favor of debates. Once you enter into this process, you enter into a different logic.
Right.
And you have to ask, given that you're going to have this open process, what are the best things inside of this process which would get you closer to the founders? You can't keep asking the old question and assume that you can go back. You have to ask analogically, what within the system produces the best consequences? And debates have their strong points.